Welcome to Historical Pulse, where history beats with life. What if one man, born into chains, could rise to shake the conscience of an entire nation, not with weapons, not with whims, but with words powerful enough to challenge slavery itself? What if a person who was once considered property could become one of the most photographed, most quoted, and most influential voices in American history? Today, we explore the extraordinary life of Frederick Douglass, a man who transformed suffering into strength, silence into speech, and bondage into one of the greatest freedom movements the world has ever seen. This is not just the story of an abolitionist. This is the story of survival, resistance, intellect, courage, and the unbreakable human desire to be free. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery around February 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. His exact birth date was never recorded. Enslaved people were rarely granted the dignity of official documentation, so Douglass later chose February 14th as his birthday, a symbolic gesture of self-definition. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, though he would later take the name Frederick Douglass after escaping slavery. From the beginning, his life was shaped by separation and loss. He never knew his exact father, though he believed he was likely a white man, possibly his enslaver, a common and painful reality for enslaved children in the American South. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was enslaved on a different plantation, and Douglass saw her only a few times during his childhood, usually at night after she had walked miles to visit him. She died when he was about 7 years old, leaving him without ever truly knowing her. Like many enslaved children, Douglass was raised by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who cared for him during his early years. But even this fragile stability was temporary. One day, he was abruptly taken away from her and sent to work on another plantation. He later described this moment as one of the earliest emotional wounds of his life, his first lesson in how slavery stripped people not only of freedom, but of family. Douglass grew up amid brutal conditions. He witnessed whippings, hunger, cold, exhaustion, and constant fear. But what marked his childhood most deeply was not only physical cruelty, but the systematic denial of knowledge. Enslaved people were deliberately kept illiterate because literacy meant awareness, and awareness threatened the system of bondage. Yet, it was precisely literacy that would become Douglass's first weapon against slavery. At around age 8, Douglass was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld. This transfer would change the course of his life. Unlike plantation life, urban slavery offered slightly less physical brutality, though it remained deeply oppressive. Sophia Auld, who had never owned enslaved people before, initially treated Douglass kindly. She began teaching him the alphabet and basic reading, but this small act of kindness was quickly shut down. Hugh Auld angrily told his wife that teaching an enslaved person to read was dangerous, that literacy would make Douglass unmanageable, dissatisfied, and impossible to control. Douglass later said that this moment, more than any other, revealed to him the true nature of slavery. If education was forbidden, it must be powerful. If knowledge was dangerous, it must be liberating. From that point forward, Douglass secretly taught himself to read. He traded bread with poor white children in exchange for reading lessons. He studied discarded newspapers, spelling books, and anything he could find. He especially remembered reading speeches and dialogues about freedom, including a famous text called The Columbian Orator, which contained speeches criticizing tyranny and slavery. These words awakened his sense of injustice and sharpened his understanding of human rights. But literacy also brought pain. As Douglass learned more about freedom, he became increasingly aware of his own bondage. He later wrote that education had made him unfit to be a slave because now he understood the Kangula, injustice of his condition, but had no immediate way to escape it. Knowledge brought hope, but also anguish. As he grew older, Douglass was sent back to rural Maryland and hired out to various enslavers, including one man who became infamous in Douglass's life, Edward Covey. Known as a slave breaker, Covey specialized in crushing the spirits of enslaved people through relentless physical and psychological abuse. Under Covey, Douglass endured severe beatings, exhaustion, and humiliation. For months, he felt himself sinking into despair. But one day, something changed. After Covey attempted to whip him yet again, Douglass fought back. For nearly 2 hours, the two men struggled physically. Though Covey was larger and armed with authority, Douglass refused to submit. Eventually, Covey gave up. He never whipped Douglass again. This moment, Douglass later wrote, was a turning point in his life, the day he reclaimed his sense of manhood and dignity. Though he was still legally enslaved, he no longer felt mentally enslaved. Resistance had restored his self-respect, and with it, his determination to be free. Douglass soon began teaching other enslaved people to read, secretly holding lessons in Sabbath schools. These gatherings were dangerous. Literacy among enslaved people was illegal, but Douglass believed knowledge was essential to liberation. The schools were eventually broken up by armed white men, yet the spark had been lit. Freedom, however, still seemed distant. After several failed escape attempts, Douglass finally succeeded in 1838. Disguised as a sailor and carrying borrowed identification papers, he boarded a train from Baltimore to the north. The journey was perilous. A single question, a suspicious glance, or a missing document could have resulted in capture, imprisonment, or death. But Douglass made it. On September 3, 1838, he arrived in New York City as a free man. He later described the moment as one of overwhelming joy mixed with fear. Though he was no longer enslaved, he was not yet safe. Slave catchers roamed the North, hunting fugitives for reward money, and the fugitive slave laws meant that even free states were not truly secure. Soon after, Douglass married Anna Murray, a free black woman who had supported his escape financially and emotionally. Together, they settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It was there that Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass, adopting a new name to avoid detection and symbolize his rebirth. Freedom transformed Douglass, but it did not quiet him. In Massachusetts, he became active in the Abolitionist movement, attending meetings, reading anti-slavery newspapers, and educating himself further. In 1841, he attended a convention where he was invited to speak about his experiences in slavery. His words stunned the audience. Here was a man who had lived slavery, who spoke with clarity, passion, intelligence, and moral force. Soon, he was recruited as a lecturer by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. At first, many white abolitionists encouraged him to stick strictly to personal testimony, to describe beatings, hunger, and escape, but to avoid intellectual analysis or political argument, as they feared it might challenge white audiences' assumptions about black intelligence. Douglass initially complied, but over time he grew frustrated. He was not content to be merely a living exhibit of suffering. He wanted to analyze, argue, persuade, and lead. And lead he did. Douglass traveled across the United States, speaking in churches, town halls, and public squares. He endured heckling, threats, violence, and disbelief. Some audiences accused him of fabricating his story because they could not accept that an enslaved man could speak so eloquently. Others tried to shout him down or intimidate him into silence. But Douglass did not retreat. In 1845, he published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book was a literary sensation. It exposed the brutal realities of slavery with unflinching honesty, naming real enslavers and detailing specific abuses. It sold thousands of copies and was translated into multiple languages, yet its success placed Douglass in danger. By revealing his identity and former enslavers, he risked being legally captured and returned to slavery. To avoid this, he traveled to Great Britain and Ireland, where he spent nearly 2 years speaking to audiences, building support for abolition and experiencing a society that, while far from perfect, did not enforce racial slavery in the same way. During this time abroad, British supporters raised money to purchase Douglass's legal freedom, ensuring he could return to the United States without fear of capture. Though Douglass disliked the idea of anyone owning him, even symbolically, he accepted the arrangement as a practical necessity. When he returned to America in 1847, he was no longer just a speaker. He was a leader. That same year, Douglass founded an abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester, New York. Its motto read, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." Through this paper, Douglass addressed not only slavery but also women's rights, education, labor, immigration, and global human rights. He used journalism as a weapon, one sharper than any blade, to expose injustice and argue for universal liberty. Douglass's relationship with other abolitionists was complex. He deeply admired William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent white abolitionist who had helped launch his public career. But Douglass gradually diverged from Garrison's philosophy. Garrison believed the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document and advocated moral persuasion without political participation. Douglass came to see the Constitution differently, as an anti-slavery document that could be interpreted to protect liberty if properly enforced. This ideological shift caused a painful break between the two men. Yet Douglass believed abolition required political engagement, legal reform, and practical action, not only moral appeals. He supported the formation of anti-slavery political parties and urged Black Americans to claim citizenship, voting rights, and civic power. Douglass also became increasingly outspoken about women's rights. In 1848, he attended the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in U.S. history, and spoke forcefully in support of women's suffrage. He argued that denying women the vote was fundamentally unjust and incompatible with democratic principles. At a time when even many reformers hesitated to support women's political equality, Douglass stood firm. He believed freedom was indivisible, that injustice to one group threatened justice for all. As tensions over slavery intensified in the 1850s, Douglass's tone became more urgent and militant. He supported resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. Douglass urged Black communities to protect fugitives, even if it meant defying the law. He famously declared that no one had the right to enslave another human being, and therefore no law enforcing slavery was morally binding. He also supported John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed violent resistance was necessary to destroy slavery. though Douglass declined to participate in Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, sensing it would fail. He defended Brown's moral conviction after his capture and execution. To Douglass, Brown's actions symbolized the desperate moral crisis of a nation unwilling to end slavery peacefully. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Douglass saw it as a turning point in American history, a conflict that could finally destroy slavery if pursued boldly. At first, the Union government hesitated to make abolition an official war aim. But Douglass pushed relentlessly, arguing that enslaved people themselves must be part of the struggle for liberation. He advocated for the enlistment of black soldiers and met personally with President Abraham Lincoln multiple times. Though the two men differed in background and perspective, Lincoln respected Douglass deeply, and Douglass came to regard Lincoln as a man who evolved morally under pressure and experience. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Douglass celebrated it as a monumental step, though he criticized its limitations and insisted that true freedom required full citizenship and legal equality. Douglass also played a crucial role in recruiting black soldiers for the Union Army, including his own sons Lewis and Charles. Douglass, who served in the famed 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black regiments in U.S. military history. For Douglass, the war was not just about preserving the Union, it was about redefining the meaning of America itself. After the war ended and slavery was abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, Douglass turned his attention to Reconstruction, the turbulent period of rebuilding the nation and defining freedom for millions of formerly enslaved people. He believed emancipation alone was not enough. Without voting rights, land ownership, education, legal protection, and economic opportunity, freedom would be hollow. He pushed for the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, securing voting rights for black men. But he also became increasingly disillusioned with the nation's retreat from Reconstruction. White supremacist violence, black codes, lynching, voter suppression, and economic exploitation continued to trap black Americans in cycles of inequality. Douglass spoke forcefully against these injustices, condemning both Southern racism and Northern indifference. One of his most famous speeches, delivered in 1876 at the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument to Abraham Lincoln, reflected his complex understanding of American history. He praised Lincoln as a man who helped destroy slavery, but also acknowledged that Lincoln was not initially a racial egalitarian. Douglass's speech was neither blind praise nor bitter condemnation. It was a nuanced meditation on leadership, progress, and moral struggle. Throughout his post-war life, Douglass held several prominent public offices, becoming one of the most visible black leaders in American government during the 19th century. He served as president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C., and later as U.S. Minister and Consul General to Haiti. Each appointment was groundbreaking, not merely symbolic, but deeply meaningful in a society still resistant to black political authority. Douglass approached these roles with seriousness and integrity, though he often encountered racism, sabotage, and public scrutiny. His diplomatic role in Haiti was particularly complex. Though he was proud to represent the United States abroad and deeply respected Haitian independence as the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere, he also criticized American imperial ambitions and defended Haiti's sovereignty when U.S. officials attempted to exploit it. Douglass was not merely a public servant, he was a public conscience. At the same time, his personal life was marked by both love and hardship. His marriage to Anna Murray Douglass endured for over 4 decades, producing 5 children and providing emotional grounding throughout his dangerous early career. Anna was not a public speaker or political activist, but her support was essential to Douglass's survival and success. Anna died in 1882 after years of illness. 2 years later, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white woman who had worked as a clerk in his office and shared his reformist beliefs. The marriage was controversial and deeply criticized by both black and white communities. Interracial marriage was taboo in much of American society at the time, and even some of Douglass's children opposed the union. Douglass defended his marriage fiercely, declaring that love, character, and shared values mattered more than race. Though the marriage brought him public backlash and family tension, he remained unapologetic, seeing it as another stand against racial barriers and social hypocrisy. Douglass continued writing, speaking, and organizing well into old age. He published 2 additional autobiographies, My Bondage and My Freedom, in 1855 and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881, later revised in 1892, each offering deeper insight into his evolving political philosophy, personal struggles, and reflections on American society. His speeches grew more philosophical over time, grappling with themes of justice, memory, moral responsibility, and the unfinished work of democracy. He warned that freedom could not be preserved without vigilance, that oppression did not vanish simply because laws changed, and that equality required sustained struggle. One of his most powerful speeches, delivered in 1852 but echoed throughout his life, was "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" He declared that for enslaved people, Independence Day was not a symbol of freedom but of hypocrisy, a reminder that the nation's as ideals had not yet been fulfilled. Yet even in his sharpest critiques, Douglass never abandoned hope. He believed deeply in the possibility of American redemption, not through denial of injustice, but through honest confrontation with it. He believed in progress, not as an automatic force, but as the result of struggle, resistance, education, and moral courage. His vision of democracy was radical in its inclusiveness. He argued not only for racial equality, but for women's rights, labor rights, religious freedom, immigrant dignity, and universal education. He opposed lynching, segregation, colonialism, and all forms of exploitation. His moral framework was simple yet demanding. If a system denied dignity to any human being, it must be challenged. As he aged, Douglass became something rare in American life, a living bridge between slavery and freedom, between the plantation and the presidency, between chains and citizenship. His very existence stood as proof that the racist assumptions underlying slavery were false. But he refused to let his life become a comforting exception. He insisted that justice must become systemic, not symbolic. In his final years, Douglass remained fiercely engaged with national debates. He continued to speak publicly, write editorials, and advise political leaders. He challenged President Rutherford B. Hayes over civil rights enforcement. He criticized Supreme Court decisions that weakened Reconstruction protections. He condemned the rising tide of lynching and racial terror across the South. He also continued supporting women's suffrage, standing alongside leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Though the women's movement sometimes fractured over race and strategy, Douglass consistently argued that justice must not be delayed for any group. On February 20th, 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a women's rights meeting in Washington, D.C., where he delivered remarks in support of suffrage. That evening, after returning home, he collapsed from a heart attack and died at the age of 77. He died as he had lived, in motion, in struggle, in service to freedom. News of his death spread quickly across the nation and the world. Tributes poured in from political leaders, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Newspapers described him as the greatest black leader of the 19th century, a towering moral voice, and one of the most powerful orators America had ever produced. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of Frederick Douglass lies not in statues, speeches, or books, but in the enduring ideas he fought for. He transformed the abolitionist movement by insisting that black voices must speak for themselves. He reshaped American political thought by interpreting the Constitution as a living document capable of advancing justice rather than protecting oppression. He redefined citizenship as not merely legal status, but moral responsibility. And he proved that the most dangerous force to tyranny is not violence alone, but truth. Douglass understood that freedom was not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right claimed by the courageous. He believed that progress required discomfort, confrontation, and perseverance. He rejected silence, accommodation, and despair. He chose instead to speak boldly, relentlessly, and unapologetically, even when his words provoked hostility, disbelief, or danger. He once wrote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." These words remain among the most quoted in American history because they capture a fundamental truth. Justice does not emerge naturally from systems of inequality. It must be insisted upon by those willing to risk comfort, reputation, and safety. Douglass's life also stands as a rebuke to simplistic narratives of American progress. His story does not suggest that freedom was inevitable or that moral evolution occurred effortlessly. Rather, it shows that every step toward justice required resistance from enslaved people who risked everything to escape from abolitionists who faced mobs and imprisonment, from soldiers who fought and died to destroy slavery, and from citizens who demanded constitutional change. Yet Douglass also rejected despair. Despite witnessing the horrors of slavery, the betrayal of Reconstruction, and the persistence of racism, he refused to abandon hope. He believed deeply in education, dialogue, civic engagement, and moral imagination. He believed people could change, not instantly, not easily, but through struggle and reflection. He believed America could change too. That belief did not come from naivete. It came from experience. He had seen himself transform from a child denied literacy into one of the most powerful thinkers of his century. He had seen enslaved people become soldiers, citizens, voters, and leaders. He had seen laws rewritten, institutions challenged, and moral boundaries expanded. His life was proof that transformation, personal and political, was possible. Frederick Douglass's legacy continues to shape modern conversations about race, democracy, freedom, and justice. His writings are studied in schools, quoted in political speeches, and invoked in civil rights movements. His life story remains one of the most extraordinary examples of human resilience in history. Yet Douglass would not want to be remembered merely as a heroic figure of the past. He would want to be remembered as a challenge, a reminder that freedom is never finished, that equality is never guaranteed, and that democracy demands constant renewal. He would want us to ask difficult questions. who is excluded today, whose voices are unheard? Where does injustice persist behind legal language or social custom? And what responsibilities do we bear, not as spectators of history, but as participants in it? Douglass believed that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity. He urged people not only to feel sympathy for the oppressed, but to act, to speak, to organize, to vote, to teach, to resist. He believed moral progress was not the work of heroes alone, but of ordinary people who refused to accept cruelty as normal. In the end, Frederick Douglass did more than escape slavery. He escaped the limitations that society tried to impose on his mind, his voice, and his humanity. He refused to be defined by bondage, race, or expectation. He defined himself through courage, intellect, discipline, and moral conviction, and in doing so, helped redefine America. His story is not merely a chapter in history. It is a mirror, reflecting both what the nation once was and what it still struggles to become. It is a reminder that freedom is fragile, justice is unfinished, and dignity must be defended, not once, but always. And perhaps most importantly, his life proves this enduring truth, that even in the darkest systems of oppression, the human spirit retains the capacity to resist, to rise, and to reshape the world. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.